Through the Imperial War Museums, the First World War saw many firsts, such as the widespread use of poison gas and trench combat. The First War happened on land, in the air, and at sea. It also brought with it the new danger of air attacks on British civilians, which killed or hurt about 4,800 people. The so-called War to End All Wars was the first time that Great Britain made people serve in the military. In 1916, the Military Service Bill was passed. It is also easy to understand why men were nervous about serving, especially after the original thrill wore off. Gas masks, flamethrowers, submarines, and tanks were all used in fight for the first time during World War I. However, cannons, sabers, and horses were still used. The rules of war changed right then and there, and the results were terrible for everyone. And the invention of new tools and weapons changed the rules for how people killed each other, making the whole world a possible battlefield and civilians targets. The Great War also led to the imprisonment of people around the world who were considered enemy aliens, according to the International Encyclopedia of the First World War. Some immigrants, like more than 400,000, lived in jail camps in Europe for years at a time. Also, between 1914 and 1919, about 32,000 Austro-Hungarians and Germans were locked up in the British Isles. People being locked up because of their race or ethnicity made xenophobia even worse because of the bloody war. Here is what you need to know about the hidden truths about Britain's camps for prisoners of war and what happened afterward. Great Britain led the charge for mass internment of civilians. According to The Conversation, Great Britain was one of the first countries to jail people who were born somewhere else. Even though Great Britain was one of the first countries to use internment camps, there isn't much academic literature on the topic. However, Jacobin reported that Britain's treatment of enemy aliens was one of the first moves in the 20th century to jail a lot of non-combatants. Starting in the 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of people, mostly Germans, came to Great Britain via our migration story. They left Germany for many reasons, one of which was to get away from the widespread hatred there. Some people wanted to avoid the problems that would come up with too many people using up resources in Germany. People in the British Isles set up support networks for each other to make the process of moving easier. There were more and more Germans moving to Great Britain, and they opened the way for other Germans to move there. Even though newcomers lived all over the country, a lot of them stayed in London. They had grown to more than 53,000 by 1911, and about half of them lived in the east and west ends of London. When World War I broke out, it became important to keep these immigrant groups under control. This is where concentration camps came in. During the war, a lot of Austrians, Germans, Turks and Bulgarians who lived, worked or came to the British Isles were jailed. The same things happened to enemy aliens in other countries. The British Isles focused on male immigrants. The British Isles were the first places to jail enemy aliens, but the International Encyclopedia of the First World War says that this quickly spread around the world. Soon, there was a camp in every part of the world, where people from enemy countries lived while they waited for the war to end. Different groups of people may have been targeted, but the British were mostly after men between the ages of 17 and 55. Even countries that were not involved, like the Netherlands, joined the anger over the prisons. About 800,000 people from Europe were put in camps during or after the First World War. A lot of men who came to Britain illegally were sent to the Isle of Man or to areas close to the Scottish borders. In other parts of the Commonwealth, people did what the country did. I will say more about this later. The Conversation says that even though these camps were very common, the stories of the people who were locked up have mostly been forgotten in British history. Some people in the UK have vague memories of the internment camps, but the event is barely mentioned in many books about the First World War. Media propaganda bolstered public opinion. The media got busy to back up the British government's plan to jail people who are seen as possible threats to national security. They made up stories on purpose to make people hate and be afraid of newcomers from countries they didn't agree with. The news was full of negative stories about possible threats from foreign residents and tourists. The German octopus and the lowest type of Hun were words that journalists used to demonize Germans and German Jews. The British Library says that newspapers and magazines used a lot of atrocity propaganda to make enemy soldiers look like they were war criminals. This wasn't hard to do because the Great War was the first time in history that total war was used on a large scale. The British Library says that more than 1 million people died during the war. It's also not an accident that the first genocide, the killing of many Armenians in the Ottoman Empire during World War I, happened at the same time. These reporters used emotional language to defend their country's actions, make people afraid of the enemy, strengthen the support of allies, and get neutral countries to work together. There was also a desire to hold accused enemy aliens by the government because of sensational stories. Waves of incarceration coincided with violence. As soon as World War I started, the Aliens Restriction Act made it harder for Germans to move to Britain. This rule made immigrants register with the local police and kept them within 5 miles of the police station. Besides that, it banned all German media and clubs. But that wasn't the end of the pain refugees in the British Isles felt. The government passed laws that let them take away immigrants' property without paying them back and shut down all businesses owned by Germans. People who were thought to be enemy aliens and their families could not live because of these rules. Refugees were finally targeted, and non-residents and foreign-born refugees in the British Isles were put in jail. But people who were locked up didn't always stay locked up, especially at the start of the war. The International Encyclopedia of the First World War says that it was more like a wave of prejudice and violence against people who were seen as foreign. Between October 1914 and May 1915, there was a lot of violence in towns and cities across the country against immigrants and tourists. People who were being targeted were sometimes locked up for their own safety because of the violence. On the other hand, the British government gave a one-dimensional reason for jailing immigrants. It was to appease the strong feeling against Germans roused by the atrocities in Belgium. When immigrants were jailed based on what the public thought, their lives were unstable and changed quickly based on the whims of the public. This was made worse by media lies. The first prisoners were quietly released. An international history book says that prisoners taken between November 1914 and February 1915 had a different experience than prisoners taken after that date. Most of them were let go without a fuss when racism subsided, and the public's safety was no longer seen as at risk. Sadly, waves of public violence were hard to plan for and could get nasty. Some of the time this meant stealing from and damaging businesses owned by immigrants. As long as the media kept spreading Germanophobia and other forms of xenophobia, newcomers were hurt. Newspapers said that people in the Central Powers were financial enemies and rude, uncontrollable thugs. To make matters worse, people from those countries had targets drawn on their backs. To put it another way, prisoners that the government let go had to deal with dangerous situations that changed every day based on what was happening at the front. It didn't change that most people thought enemy aliens were dangerous strangers who might be active as spies. The same was true for how the press and people in general portrayed them as evil. That's why the British government was so quiet when they let these refugees go. In Great Britain during World War I, officials knew how dangerous things were for Germans, Bulgarians, Austro-Hungarians and Turks. But then, the sinking of the Lusitania changed everything for good. It brought the United States into the war and made Germany look really, really bad in the eyes of the rest of the world. The sinking of the Lusitania ramped up imprisonment. When the Lusitania sank on May 7, 1915, it stopped the trend of people being locked up and then freed in Great Britain. 20 minutes after a German U-boat fired 2 bombs at it, the fancy steamer sank. In all, 1,195 people died in the tragedy, and 128 of them were Americans. It's not enough to say that the sinking put a lot of stress on ties between Germany and the United States. Because of this, the US joined the war on the side of the British and French. But the event made people all over the world angry, not just Americans. British people took to the streets during the Lusitania riots, which is what the International Encyclopedia of the First World War calls them. According to the National Archives, there was violence against Germans all over the country, which made the people very vulnerable. It was also a turning point for the British when they started putting a lot of male enemy aliens in jail. It was the end of quiet launches. Because of this change in policy, the number of prisoners rose from 12,871 in May 1915 to 32,400 by November of that same year. The Aliens Advisory Body for England and Wales was set up to keep an eye on these prisons, and Scotland had its own body. No matter how these committees were set up, it wasn't easy to see what they were doing or why they were making choices. People met behind closed doors, and the notes they kept haven't been found since. Daily life for internees. The conversation says that many of the people who were jailed as a result of the First World War were facing being sent away from the British mainland for good. Tens of thousands of people were sent to the Isle of Man and made to live at Noccolo camp. They lived in huts that were made like military barracks and could hold 60 men each, from Richard Dove's book, Totally Un-English, Britain's Internment of Enemy Aliens in 2 World Wars. People can still see the concrete platforms where these open-plan wooden buildings used to be. There were at least 16 concentration camps in the British Isles, but Noccolo camp was the biggest. It held about 20,000 prisoners who had been locked up for years behind barbed wire walls. Noccolo had its own post office and railroad line. It was made up of 4 camps that were split into 23 units. It was always boring, but the smartest internees found ways to stay busy by continuing to work or helping other people in the camp. So there were working shoemakers, hairdressers, and tailors in the camp. In prison, people went to school, and theatre, sports, and music clubs and groups sprung up. Even though the prisoners worked hard, they were often bored, unsure, and depressed. A Swiss camp inspector named Dr. Vischer called this mix of boredom and emotion barbed wire disease. Inmates were bothered by this so-called disease while they were in jail and for the rest of their lives because it left lasting psychological scars. Prisoner treatment reflected national image concerns. The International Encyclopedia of the First World War says that even though Great Britain decided to jail a lot of enemy aliens, they also wanted to keep a good public image. It was hard to choose, especially when innocent people are jailed for an unknown amount of time because of where they are from. To make things look as humanitarian and good for the press as possible, prisoners were treated pretty well in the camps. The country also made it clear that things like class differences would be recognized in the camps. This meant building gentlemen's camps for people from the upper class. There were special facilities at Lofthouse Park, which is near Wakefield, and at Douglas on the Isle of Man. One person who lived in Lofthouse Park said it was a true Beamtenstadt, or bureaucratic state, where everyone enjoyed having a job. In order to keep up the picture of their country as very civilized, the British carefully and wisely followed international law. After all, the British media wanted to keep calling the Germans savage, so they had to show how different they were. In a way, the richest people in camp society had a long, forced vacation behind the barbed wire of their camps. But even the poorest prisoners were treated with respect, as required by international law. How international law shaped the internment experience. According to the International Encyclopedia of the First World War, Great Britain fought a war of both arms and words against Germany and its supporters. There were claims that Germany had broken international law by acting cruelly in Belgium. Great Britain portrayed itself as a very civilized country that would not give in to violence and revenge, even during a brutal, all-out war, in order to be the best contrast to Teutonic Germany. Even though tens of thousands of people were in jail, the country kept a good reputation in many ways. Following the rules set out in the Hague Convention of 1899, Great Britain carefully followed international law obligations. This is according to Richard Dove's book, Totally Un-English: Britain's Internment of Enemy Aliens in Two World Wars. People who were interned were never made to work, and women and children were free during the war, though they were limited in where they could go and were watched. Neutral mission staff, such as Swiss and American officials, made sure that nothing bad or strange happened behind closed doors. In 1914, when the American embassy went there, officials said, "Their quarters are comfortably furnished but without luxury," via Totally Un-English. Even though deliberate physical harm was unlikely to happen in the internment camps, being locked up for years with no end in sight was a terrible mental experience that people lived with. Yes, the rooms were nice and the food was enough, but prisoners of war had to go years without seeing their families and had to deal with unfair criticism and being cut off from British society as a whole. The British used enemy aliens as bargaining chips. From March 1916 to March 1917, the International Encyclopedia of the First World War says that Great Britain had 10 times as many German civilian prisoners and 50 times as many Austro-Hungarian prisoners as British citizens who were being held in Germany and Austria-Hungary. The large number of prisoners in Britain were used as strong bargaining chips to make sure that British prisoners were safe and healthy. When calls came in from Germany about an all-for-all exchange of prisoners, Great Britain did not want to be a part of it. Instead, the British government started trading prisoners one for one, which gave them a huge edge over enemy countries. Due to Britain's stance on civilian prisoners, there were not many prisoner exchanges during the war. People who were successfully swapped included those who were not fit to serve in the military, a number of internees from well-known families, and some people aged 45 and up. Great Britain and Germany only traded a few prisoners with each other, but enemy aliens from the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria were stuck because of where they were. Because it was so hard to get prisoners from one place to another by sea or land, exchange deals never came to fruition. Still, during the war, there were less than 100 prisoners from these countries still in the British Isles. This meant that they were not a concern for either side. Enemy aliens in the Commonwealth also faced incarceration. The International Encyclopedia of the First World War says that outsiders were also locked up in Britain's dominions and colonies. The people who lived in Australia were hit the hardest by these practices. Down under 4,500 Austro-Hungarians and 6,890 Germans were going to be sent to camps because the government wanted to strengthen the British identity of the country. People who weren't British were not allowed to enter because of this policy. This included about 700 German-born Australians who became citizens in the decades before World War I. Germans who lived in other British countries around the world had the same thing happen to them. People from Southeast Asia were taken to camps in Australia to be held. Soon, the British Commonwealth changed its social ranks based on race, nationality, and ethnicity, putting white Britishers first, next black Britishers, and last of all, aliens. The moving didn't stop there. Germans who lived in British East Africa were being forced to move to India. Germany sent preachers to Egypt who were working in Palestine, which was a British colony at the time. When people were forced to move, it was okay because of military security. But Germany had a different view by the end of the war. 130 Germans were held by the British in Egypt in 1918. Another 1,023 were held in India, the Caribbean, Malta, and South Africa. Germany thought that the forced German emigration was a planned action by the Allies to get rid of Germans in their own countries. But charges like that were shot down by Great Britain and the Allies. Daily life for enemy aliens felt like prison. The International Encyclopedia of the First World War says that the way non-incarcerated enemy aliens were treated also made them feel like they were in jail. Women, children, and men over 55 had to follow rules like local curfews, giving their names to the police, and staying away from prohibited areas. These rules came from the Aliens Restriction Act of 1914 and following orders in council. They had to have an effect on almost every part of life. People who were seen as enemy aliens were not allowed to own cars, cameras, motorbikes, homing pigeons, or military maps because many people were afraid they would be used for spying. They also couldn't go to places that were thought to be off-limits. The National Archives say that these rules applied to both immigrants and British women who married men from other countries. This means that Queen Victoria and Prince Albert would have been enemy aliens too, if they had lived a few decades later. People who were not in jail but were enemy aliens had to deal with the steady threat of violence from other people. They also had to deal with bad press that kept spreading racist rage and making them look like bad guys. When all of the family's male members of military age were locked up, life was anything but nice. Families were broken up for years, and most lost their main source of income for good. Businesses owned by enemy aliens shut down, and immigrants and the women who married them lost their freedom to move. Many people were scared and worried about their futures and the outcome of the war after this long and scary event. From internment camps to deportation. The International Encyclopedia of the First World War reports that there were disturbing facts that added to the charges of a forced German diaspora. From 1914 to 1919, the number of Germans living in Britain dropped from 57,500 to 22,254. By 1919, 6,150 Germans had left Australia. During the war, German groups that used to be very strong in places like Bradford, Leeds, London, Manchester, Glasgow, and Liverpool went away. The same thing happened abroad, causing a lot of trouble for newcomers who had to leave their homes. Germany's old colonies in Africa were taken over, and most German residents could no longer get residency permits. In the colonies, people were very mean to German refugees, leaving many of them with nowhere to go. Even though World War I finished in 1918, policies against enemy aliens kept going with the Aliens Restriction Amendment Act 1919. This act made it harder to hire foreigners, and once prisoners got out of jail, they were often deported. It's interesting that other groups got rights while enemy aliens lost them. For instance, officials gave women over 30 and low-income military veterans the right to vote, even though these groups had not had that right before. Because of this, there was a strange march toward democracy for some, while others lost their voting rights at the same time, and racism and hostility toward immigrants persisted. Many people had to go from years in prison to being sent back to their home countries, where they were burdened by war debt and guilt. This was like going from one bad situation to another. We hope you liked this video. Watch another video here.